Back in chapter 3 of Amos and in verse 6, I want to start by drawing your attention to one of the questions which Amos asked amid that string of questions that were there. He said, "Shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord hath not done it?" And he's essentially asking, is it ever the case that bad things happen and it's got absolutely nothing to do with God? Now just pause for a minute and answer that in your own heart. Is it ever the case that a bad thing happens, that troubling circumstances come, whether to a nation or to individuals? Is it ever the case that troubles come and God has nothing to do with it? God isn't in it? Now, I don't know what answer you've just given in your own mind, but when Amos asks the question, the answer he is expecting to automatically be taken for granted is that God is always involved in it. The consistent teaching throughout the Bible is that God is sovereign over all things. He is perfectly in control of all that happens. There is nothing in this world that happens on the big scale or on the small scale that is outside of his plan and purpose. When evil comes then, when troubles, when hardship or even war comes to a city, God has done it. Now, of course, others might have been involved too. There are times when maybe men have done it too. You think of the crucifixion of Christ. Men with wicked hands took the Savior and nailed him to the cross. Men were involved there. Men did it. But so did God. So did God. It all happened according to his plan and purpose. While God is not guilty for the sins of men, when there's trouble in a city, the Lord has done it. That's what Amos would expect his hearers to recognize. Now that thought becomes very important now in chapter 4, because central to this whole chapter is the fact that numerous troubles have been coming to Israel. We've read of some of these things. In verse 6, there's reference to times of famine, or at least difficulty in securing your food. In verse 7, there's reference to drought. In verse 9, there's agricultural disaster through crop disease and through the plague of palmer worms, or that's a type of locust. Then in verse 10, there were diseases similar to what happened in Egypt at the time of the Exodus, those judgments which God sent then. There's also reference to war, the young men of the country slain by the sword, the horses captured, the military strength reduced, and even death in the army camps. Verse 11 refers to some remarkable destructions, like when the fire and brimstone fell upon Sodom and Gomorrah. These things had been occurring in Israel. I'm not sure how many of them had occurred in just the very recent time before Amos preached, but they had been occurring at various points over Israel's history. And what are we to make of all those things? Were they just coincidences? Were they just freaks of nature? Were they just natural phenomena? And God had nothing to do with it? Well, no, that's not to be our conclusion. When evil came to the city, or to the nation in this case, the Lord had done it. And with that in mind, it is a very relevant chapter to you and me, because we have to deal with that same question regarding the various events that come our way. Again, answer the question in your own mind. Does trouble ever come your way, personally? Does trouble ever enter into your life and God hasn't done it? It's got nothing to do with him. Does hardship or disaster, health issues, family trouble ever come your way and it's got nothing to do with God? Well, Amos expects us to recognize the Lord is in it. The Lord is very much involved in it. This chapter presents us with the theme of what I'm going to call God's providential chastisements. The Lord's providential work as he rules over this world and as he brings troubles the way of his people. That's what he's doing with Israel here. Whether it's famine or drought or war or disease or whatever, God is bringing troubles, purposely bringing troubles the way of Israel. Providential chastisements. Now, first of all, let's think about the reason for these chastisements. The reason. These troubles described are not sent without reason. And that reason is apparent when you think of especially the first 5 verses of this chapter. Again, you have similar condemnations of Israel's sin here. The oppression, the crushing of the needy. But in connection with that, there's also what seems like a total blindness in Israel. They're not only sinful and living in rebellion against God, but they are blind in their sin. I want you to Notice first in these first verses that God sends providential chastisements, providential rebukes to Israel, because Israel, first of all, are distracted by riches. They're distracted by riches. In verse 1, Amos describes the people like kine, or cattle of Bashan. Now, Bashan, that was an area on the east of the River Jordan. It was known for its fertile land, its good plains. It was good ground for cattle, and therefore it was ideal for raising cattle. It was known for its strong bulls. You think of how, was it the psalmist used that language? The bulls of Bashan surrounding me. The strong bulls, that's the idea. They've been raised on good pasture, strong bulls. Known for strong bulls, known for fattened cows. Well, Amos is using that picture, the fattened cows. He's calling the people fattened cows. Now, because of the feminine words that are used here, some understand it to be a condemnation, particularly of the women of Israel, as if they are fattened cows, encouraging their husbands to gain more and more, even oppressing the poor to do so, in order to give more of the life of luxury to them. I don't personally take that line. That maybe helps me out to not get on the wrong side of women here. I think I've heard of some preachers who've, especially those maybe fiery ones who are standing in the pulpit and challenging the fat cows of the congregation. That's not what I'm intending to do here, although maybe the Lord could challenge all of us with that terminology. I take the line that Amos is again condemning the people altogether, particularly those who are prosperous through ill-gotten gain, crushing the needy to advance themselves. He's describing the people as these fattened cows, fattening themselves up on the riches of the land, greedily eating themselves into a stupor as they feed on riches. Israel have set aside the pursuit of treasure in heaven to pursue treasure on earth. They've set aside the pursuit of godliness to pursue worldliness, and therefore they're utterly distracted from the Word of God, the things of God, from walking with God, too busy fattening themselves up on the riches of this world. And the Lord warns them here, it'll lead to ruin. These fattened cows will be led away to the slaughter. The hooks will be put in their nose, as it were, and they'll be led away. Now that condemnation stands as a strong warning to all of us, I think. Because lift your eyes and look at the country around us. Is this not exactly what we see? Apart from the fact that Amos is preaching directly to Israel, and we know that that's his audience, could you not say that you read this book and replace Israel with maybe Australia or with America or with some of the Western societies today? Would you not say that this is quite a fitting description of society around about us? People utterly distracted from the things of God because they're too busy feasting on the riches of this world, running after the riches of this world, pursuing more and more of what this world has to offer them. Are many people not like cattle fattening themselves up? And when people are so distracted by riches, is it any wonder when the Lord comes with providential chastisements, introducing trouble into lives, perhaps even into the nation as a whole, that men might lift their eyes off the glittering gold around them and get some perspective and see what really matters? Is it any wonder troubles might come the way of a nation, that the Lord even might strip away some of the riches of a nation so that our attention might be lifted onto Him where it ought to be? And on the personal level, there's the challenge to each one of us. What are you pursuing in life? Certainly, again, I've said before, there's no automatic condemnation of being relatively wealthy given in Scripture. No condemnation automatically of that, but there is a condemnation of the pursuit of these things whenever it is a hindrance to walking with God. There's a complete rejection of idolizing gold and wealth and all these things and following after that rather than the Lord. What are you pursuing? Where is your treasure today? In heaven or on earth? Does the Lord perhaps have to get your attention, injecting trouble into your life? See, these providential chastisements were sent because many were distracted by riches. You'll also notice that these chastisements were sent because many were deceived by religion. They were deceived by religion. This was another major issue in Israel at the time. The people were not striving to walk with God in the way that they ought. But that's not to say that the land was irreligious. Religion was everywhere. In this period of Israel's history, it was about as religious as you could get. There was great religious fervor. You look at verses 4 and 5. And Amos points out the things that the people were doing. They were coming to Bethel and to Gilgal, which is where Israel had set up their altars, supposedly for the service of God. They were bringing sacrifices every morning. They were bringing their tithes every third year like they were supposed to do. They were offering their great Thanksgiving offerings. Those were the offerings that you were allowed leaven with. The Thanksgiving offerings were being offered. All this religious practice was being very openly acknowledged. Everything was published. Everything was proclaimed. Everyone knew what was going on. All this activity was happening in the name of the Lord. It looked like an awful lot of devotion to their God, and the people loved to do these things. That's what Amos is saying when he says at the end of verse 5, "For this liketh you." This is what you like to do, Israel. This is what your heart is set on doing. All this religious activity, all of this supposed devotion unto God. But look at how the Lord sees it all. It's very different to how the people see it. Look at verse 4. The Lord says through Amos, "Come to Bethel and transgress. At Gilgal, multiply transgressions." See, there was a lot of religious activity. They were still fulfilling some requirements of the law, but it was all outward religion with no real heart for God, no heart to obey God, no repentance, no faith, just outward religion. A lot of it, very devout outward religion, but just religion, just outward religion. And you can, in fact, see the fact that there was no heart for God, really, even when you consider where this was all taking place. If the people were sincere in their desire to honor God and worship Him, then they would have been going to the temple at Jerusalem. They would have been going to the place that God had appointed for His sacrifices, for His worship. Really, the sacrifices were to be brought there, to Jerusalem, to the temple. That's what God had appointed. But instead, these things were all being carried out at Bethel and Gilgal. These were religious sites that had been set up as replacements to Jerusalem. I can't remember if we mentioned before in the study of Amos, but back in Israel's history, Jeroboam was the first king of Israel after he rebelled against Rehoboam, the Davidic king. He rebelled. You had the separation of the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. And at that time, his big worry was, we don't want our Israelite people going down to Judah. We don't want them going down to Jerusalem, bringing their offerings, because what if they then start to feel allegiance to the kingdom of Judah and they desert us? We can't have that. So he'd remedied the problem. He'd set up 2 golden calves at Bethel and Dan, meant to be images of Jehovah. And he'd set other religious sites had been set up and come to be used as well. And what it allowed was the people to supposedly worship God, but with much more convenience. You don't need to go to Jerusalem. You don't need to worry about that. You go to these places. Go to Bethel, go to Dan, go to Gilgal, go to these places where the altars are set up. And you can worship God there. There's a lot of outward religious activity, a lot of devotion, undoubtedly a lot of very emotional experiences as people offered these sacrifices at Gilgal or Bethel, and they saw wonderful things happening. But in reality, Israel have set aside the command of God. They're not worshipping Him at the place of His choosing. They're not worshipping Him in the appropriate way. They're mixing their worship of God with idolatry and pagan practices, and really they've exchanged true religion for one of convenience, one of their own personal preferences. They've exchanged the worship of God for worship that sort of suits them. And yet they're very active in it, doing all sorts of things. And what it serves to do is to pacify their conscience, to make them feel good about themselves, to make them feel like God is on their side. After all, they're having all these wonderful experiences as they bring their sacrifices here and there and have their Thanksgiving celebrations and all the rest. What a wonderful celebration it was as we gathered together with the people at Bethel. And what a day that was when we offered the Thanksgiving sacrifice. What experiences they had. And they use these things to tell themselves that God is on their side as they engage in all this activity. Again, what a need there was then for a wake-up call, because God was not pleased with their worship. It was really man-centered worship. They might be soothing their own consciences, but all they were really doing was multiplying transgressions, making their account worse. They needed the wake-up call of providential chastisements, God bringing troubles their way. Again, we need to be very aware of that danger for ourselves. Of course, even in our own society as a whole? Are there not many places where many things are done in the name of worshipping God? And let's face it, it's far much more about having a nice religious experience than actually going to the Word of God and seeing how God would desire to be worshipped and worshipping Him as He has revealed Himself to us. There's a very limited way in which Christ is proclaimed in His fullness as the Saviour for sin. Instead, is it not replaced so often with a very flesh-satisfying form of worship that's convenient to men, and it's used to satisfy the conscience. Oh, God is on our side. Look at all our religion, and look at the experiences we've had. Now, let's not just point the finger outside, even for ourselves. Let's face it, we can deceive ourselves, even with striving after good religion. Religion itself is not a bad thing, by the way. I know that word gets a bad reputation nowadays, but religion itself, the word comes from the idea of being bound to God, serving the Lord. That's a good thing. We want to be bound to God and serving Him. But we can deceive ourselves even with good religion, because it's never meant to be merely external. Even gathering into a place where Christ is preached, where the Saviour is proclaimed, you can fool yourself that all's well, because sure, you were there at church last Sunday and the one before and the one before that, and sure, it was great when we were singing the hymns or singing the psalm or whatever. If it stops there, if it's just outward, if it's just religious practice, how dangerous it is if you're using that to soothe your conscience and to tell yourself that God is on your side. True religion flows from the new birth. It flows from a sight of Christ. It flows from a love of Christ and a joy in Christ found through faith in Christ. All of that was missing in most of Israel. They needed the wake-up call of chastisement from God. So we've thought about the reason for these chastisements. But then I want you to think about the demand of these chastisements. The demand. Notice the phrase that just continually comes up in this chapter. You see it in verses 6, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Yet have ye not returned unto me, saith the Lord. The continual pattern, God says, I've done this thing, I've brought this trouble, whether it's famine or drought or whatever. I've brought this thing, yet have ye not returned unto me. I brought this thing, yet have ye not returned unto me. I then brought this thing, yet have ye not returned unto me. Now, that phrase, I suppose it shows you Israel's failure. They didn't return to the Lord as they should. But it also emphasizes that when God sent these troubles their way, when He sent hunger or thirst or disease or whatever, He did so with the expectation of a response. The people were meant to respond to these things. God was not just lashing out in frustration at a disobedient people. He was sending these things to get the attention of the people and to prompt a response in the people. Specifically, that they would return unto Him. These warnings were not just to be ignored then. They demanded a response. The people were to respond to these things. Now, when trouble comes our way, whether it's as a nation or whether it's as individuals, troubles always call for a response. We are not meant to just grin and bear our troubles and work our way through them. We're meant to take them as a real prompt to seek the Lord, to draw near to Him. And that's always the case. Let me stress that it's always the case. When troubles come your way, it is meant to be a prompt for you to draw near to God. Now, if you're going to respond in the right way to the troubles that come, I suppose the starting place is to recognize that those troubles do in fact come from the Lord. When there's evil in a city, God has done it. When there's trouble in the nation, God has done it. When there's trouble in my life, God has done it. He has brought it my way. We need to recognize that as a starting place. The Lord is involved in this. Now, let's face it today, when trouble hits the country, we often carry on as if God has got absolutely nothing to do with it. And I think that's all the more common today when I suppose we can, for a lot of things anyway, we can get a fair handle on what's happening. We can sort of semi-understand the science of what's involved, and we can break it all down. When there's a bad fire season, we maybe put it down to higher temperatures and stronger winds. Some will go further and they'll explain the strong winds and the higher temperatures as results of climate change, and all these things are just natural and to be expected because of the conditions in the world, and it's just natural stuff going on and God's not involved. Or when coronavirus hits the country, we can explain to some extent how it spreads, maybe whether it's through the air or through droplets on surfaces, and you touch them and you get the virus and so on. We can sort of loosely get a handle on how diseases work, what's actually going on. And then amid all the scientific explanation, how rare it is for the nation to stop in its track and ask the question and answer it. Shall there be evil in a city? And the Lord hath not done it. The Lord has done it. He has. Now, I'm not denying that there are scientific explanations for many of these things. I'm not denying either that many of these things occur in a fairly natural way. But that doesn't take away the fact that God has done it. You think of the ultimate judgment that Amos threatened against Israel. His ultimate threatening was that an enemy nation would rise up against Israel and destroy them, carry them away into captivity. And the Assyrians did that. Now, you could stand back and explain that judgment in terms of human activity. An enemy nation is looking to get more land. They like the look of Israel's riches. They want to plunder those riches for themselves. They want to expand their borders. It's not as if God revealed a vision to the Assyrian king and told him to go and take down Israel. That didn't happen. The Assyrians were just looking on and they thought, well, we like the look of that land. We think we can conquer it, so we'll do that. You can explain that in terms of human activity, human covetousness, human greed perhaps. But that doesn't change the fact that God was involved in it. It happened as he had threatened it would. It happened as a predicted judgment from him against a rebellious people. Now, today we're so used to using science in order to leave God out of the picture and to tell ourselves we don't really need to think about the Lord in this. We've got it all explained without him. God isn't in it. But even when you can explain what exactly is going on, even if you can explain the thing perfectly, that does not change the fact that the Lord is in it. In fact, for the Christian, when you study science, you're really studying, in many ways, the providential workings of God in this world, because so much of what God does in this world is through natural means. At times, yes, he works miraculously, but so much of what the Lord does is through natural things that you can study, that you can investigate, you can work out what's going on to some extent. Understanding it, if you do, does not change the fact that the Lord is in it. And when the Lord is in it and troubles come, it calls for a response. It calls for you, it calls for me to respond to the troubles that come our way. And how are we meant to respond? Like Israel should have done, by returning unto the Lord. When God sends judgments the way of a nation, whether it's wildfires or droughts or earthquake or water or coronavirus or whatever, the nation ought to respond by returning unto the Lord, by humbling ourselves before God, by recognizing we need to seek him because we're showing here how fragile we are. These things are calls to return. Likewise, when trouble comes your way personally, when there's hardship in your family or in your working life, or when there's health issues, they are always prompts for you to draw nearer unto God, to return unto the Lord. Now, I want to be careful here. Not every trouble is a chastisement from God. Sometimes God sends you trouble because you haven't been with him where you ought to be. You're walking at a distance, you've been wayward, and the Lord has to rebuke you. Like he did in love for Jonah. When Jonah refused to obey God and he ended up cast in the sea, he was rebuked for his waywardness. There's times when trouble comes for that reason. Then there's other times where you're walking with God, you're serving the Lord, you're close to the Lord, trouble comes. And it's not a rebuke, it's not chastisement. You're suffering like Job. The Lord was pleased with Job, but trouble still came. You're not being rebuked, but you're still suffering. The Lord at times uses suffering to purify us, to produce fruit in our lives. Christ taught us in John 15 that he's the vine, and he talks about his believers as branches, and he said that every branch in him that beareth fruit, the Father purgeth it or prunes it. that it may bring forth more fruit. And there's a picture of the father as a farmer in the vineyard, and he sees a branch and he's pleased with the branch. It's bearing fruit, but he prunes it. There's some cutting involved there so that it might bring forth more fruit. There are times when God's people are suffering, and it's not chastisement, it's not rebuke, it's simply God pruning, that we might bring forth more fruit. It's simply the Lord purifying like silver, that we might be all the more Christ-like. Then there's other times we suffer, and it's purely the result of persecution and trouble that comes when we're faithful to Christ. It's not a chastisement. So there are many reasons we suffer, and many different reasons for troubles to come. It's not always that you've been disobedient to God. And if you're in a time of trouble and there's nothing obvious to your thinking, there's nothing obvious in your conscience that you can put your finger on and say, well, you've been disobedient to God, you don't need to panic for days and wonder, what have I done wrong to be facing this? It's not always the case that you have done something wrong. The Lord uses troubles for other reasons too. But because of all these different possibilities, sometimes we get tied up in knots. We try and answer that question. How do I know when trouble is sent my way? How do I know that it's a chastisement from God? How do I know that it's not just simply a means of God strengthening me, or simply coming my way because I'm being faithful to Christ? How do I know what's a rebuke and what's not? Really, you don't need to answer that question. At least it's not urgent. See, whatever the reason for trouble, our response is always to be the same. Our response is always that we draw nearer to the Lord. If you've been walking close with the Lord, you examine your heart, as we're always prone to do, or always must do, and you see, is there any sin in me that needs to be confessed afresh, that needs to be brought to Christ, and I draw near to God. If you've been wayward, trouble comes. It's a prompt. Assess your heart. You'll find the problem. The Lord will not be rebuking you without showing you the problem. You find the problem, bring it to the Lord, confess it, and draw near to God. Whatever the reason for troubles, our response is to be the same. Draw near to God, return unto the Lord, seek all the more refuge in Christ. That's the response troubles call for. And it's especially the case then when chastisements come from God, as they do in this chapter, that they are a call for repentance, for a return to God as you seek forgiveness by faith in Christ. So we could ask the question, how do you respond to trouble? Whatever the reason it's coming for. Are troubles driving you into the arms of Christ, into the care of the Saviour? Are they driving you to run unto Him and to embrace Him as your foundation for life and for eternity? Or are you refusing to return unto the Lord and struggling on, trying to meet the problems in your own strength, like Israel? These chastisements demanded a response. Israel were to return. I want you to think then as well about the grace in these chastisements, the grace. I've pointed out before in this study, and it's worth keeping in mind when we're dealing with these passages that are full of warnings and judgments and strong language. As we go through all of this, and we see the warnings of God, or even the chastisements here, the rebukes, we ought to appreciate that there is a wonderful expression of the grace of God in all of this. First of all, you think of these numerous rebukes. We've addressed the fact that they're all given so as to get Israel's attention and to turn Israel back to the Lord. And so these chastisements, they show, firstly, the gracious desire of the Lord here. Israel are living in rebellion, living foolishly. But the Lord isn't just leaving them to it. The Lord isn't just letting them carry on in rebellion and rush on to ruin. No, He's getting their attention. He's striving with them, chastising them, so that they might turn around from their folly and seek Him. In many ways, the Lord is like a loving father here, who wisely and lovingly chastises their child. In fact, in Scripture, it emphasizes that principle in terms of parenting. The loving parent is the one who does rebuke their child and chastise their child. Maybe to us today it looks more loving if a parent just lets their child away with anything. Oh, they're a nice parent to get on with. Except really, According to Scripture, that's not an expression of love at all, because you're letting that child grow up and walk a path of ruin. The loving parent is the one who chastises, who calls out the sin in their children, who rebukes it, who challenges it, who chastises it. Well, that's how the Lord is dealing with his people here, in love, chastising them. Not just to be cruel, not just to inflict some payback on the people who have been rebellious, but with a real desire that they might return to a way of blessing, that they might return unto him and have blessing through him. And that emphasizes that the Lord was willing to receive Israel back to himself. In fact, in the next chapter, we'll see that the Lord was calling Israel to seek him and to live. The Lord was still willing to receive this rebellious people. And of course, for you and me, the principle is the same. When troubles come your way, you've been perhaps wayward, you've gotten far from where you ought to be, but the Lord has brought trouble your way and he's seeking to get your attention. That in itself is a token of his love. He's not just leaving you to go to ruin. It's a token of his love. And it emphasizes to you that God is willing to receive you. The very fact that he bothers sending you trouble doesn't just leave you carefree in rebellion. The very fact that he sends you trouble, calling you to return, it indicates that he's standing there like the father of the prodigal son at the window, waiting for his wayward child to come on up the road, and he's ready to run with open arms and to receive you. That's what it emphasizes. The Lord is willing to receive. He has a desire for the return of his wayward people. You're not going to return to God then ever, just to be sent away again. That was the fear, I suppose, of the prodigal son. You can imagine him. He's wasted his father's substance. He's lived in rebellion, and he's coming back and he's saying, I'm not fit to be your child anymore. And he's undoubtedly panicky. Will my father even be willing to have me in the house? But of course his father was willing, and his father's love for him went far beyond anything he had imagined. Not only is he restored as the servant, but he's restored as a full son in the house of the Father. I tell you, you'll never return unto God, regardless of how much shame you've brought to yourself. You'll never return unto God just to be sent away again. He stands ready through Christ, the Redeemer, to receive you and save you and restore you. There's grace in God greater than all our sin. Now, on top of that, as you think of the grace demonstrated in these chastisements and his willingness, God's willingness to receive a wayward people, notice the patience that's here. There's great patience. Throughout the chapter, you have the Lord using trouble after trouble after trouble after trouble. And it's not just that he disciplines once and then he immediately destroys Israel when they refuse to respond. No, he continues to chastise again and again and again. And it shows you the patience of the Lord. Now, when you think of the chastisements here, there is almost that idea of these things getting progressively more serious, more severe. First in verse 6 through 9, there's mention made of difficulty getting food and water, although it seems that the people were still able to get their hands on something. The 3 cities went to the one in verse 8, and they got the water they needed, although there was lack. There was trouble there with food and water. Verse 10, things get a bit more severe after Israel refused to return to God. There's disease in the land. There's even death through military defeats. Again, Israel refused to respond aright. So in verse 11, things get worse again. And there are some parts of the land where there are great disasters. Some places are overthrown, like Sodom and Gomorrah. And when the fire and brimstone fell upon them, things are getting even more severe, more painful. But in all of this, God is being very patient. He's giving more than one opportunity. Time after time after time he comes, and yes, with perhaps progressively more severe chastisements, but patiently he's acting like a loving father who is disciplining his child, doing so with measured discipline to bring his child back from folly. He disciplines the first time, but you think of the parent, disciplining the first time, the child doesn't respond as this should, so the next time the discipline gets a little bit more firm, a little bit more painful perhaps, but the child still isn't responding, and they're not just kicked out of the house straight away. They're not just sent on their way. 5-year-old, get out the door, don't want anything more to do with you, you've rebelled. No, there's discipline, and it gets perhaps worse as the child refuses to take heed. But there's patience, and that's what you see in the Lord here. He's not casting away his people immediately. There's patience, time after time after time. Yes, he intensifies the discipline because they didn't take notice the first time. They need to have something a bit more severe to get their attention. But he's patient. He's not made a full end of them yet. And of course, how much grace there is as you think of the patience of God, not just to Israel here, but to you and me. How many times when we've been slow to respond to the call of the Lord, slow to respond when he's graciously come, even bringing troubles our way, striving with us to get our attention, and sometimes he might even have had to increase the troubles. But he hasn't just cast us off to destruction. In fact, the fact that we're gathered here tonight, we've still got life in our bodies, we've still got the opportunity of hearing the gospel. The Lord has patiently rebuked again and again and again, and he's given us opportunity after opportunity to seek him and to live. And how good that our God is patient. And again, what an expression of his desire to restore. He is reluctant here to cast off Israel to ruin. The Lord is reluctant to do so, as it were. He wants to restore them. Our God desires wayward people to be restored. So if tonight you're far from where you ought to be in your own soul, you're not walking with God as you should, the Lord desires to restore you. He desires to renew fellowship with you. He desires to receive you again. And since the Lord shows it with his patience to you, would it not again encourage you then to arise and to seek him and to receive of his grace and his kindness as it is extended to you? He's not a ferocious God immediately looking to destroy. He is wisely chastening in love, that wayward people might be turned again onto him. I do want to finish, though, by stressing the limitation on these chastisements. There is a limitation here. We've talked about the reluctance of God to utterly destroy Israel, his patience in dealing with them. He's calling again and again and again for the return of these people. But they refuse again and again and again. And so finally, the time comes when patience must run out. If you refuse to respond to God's patience, if you refuse every opportunity to turn from sin unto the Lord, if you ignore all his chastisements, finally patience has to reach an endpoint. After challenging Israel time after time after time, and they've not returned, you look at verse 12. This is where it all comes to a climax. It says, "Therefore, thus will I do unto thee, O Israel, and because I will do this unto thee, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel." Now that text, and particularly the last line of it, "prepare to meet thy God," is quite often used as an evangelistic sense, calling for people to make preparation for eternity by seeking Christ. And I suppose that's a good call. That's a call right throughout the Scripture. Scripture sets the gospel before us, and it does call for us throughout to prepare to meet our God. It warns us of the day when we all must stand before the judgment seat of Christ and meet God, and what a need there is to be prepared, to have our sin forgiven, so that we're not meeting God guilty and in our sin and ready for judgment, ready for being cast into hell. We need to be prepared for that day, and we can be through Christ. So the call of the Word of God throughout is prepare to meet thy God in that sense. But really, when you take this text in that sense, you're lifting it out of its context, because that's not the sense here. That's not the sense here. In its context, really, this is not a statement of gracious invitation anymore. This is a statement of judgment. God is essentially saying to Israel, I have chastised and chastised and chastised you. I have sent numerous troubles your way. I've sent famine and hunger. I've sent drought and thirst. I've sent disease. I've sent military defeat. I've sent troubles and disasters of all sorts, and you have refused to take heed. So prepare to meet me, for I am coming. That's the sense of it. You can expect to see me now as I come against you in judgment. The Lord told them at the start of the chapter that those fat calves would be led away by hooks to the slaughter, And God is saying now, prepare to meet me, for I am finally coming now against you. And the sense of it is, when I do, you will not stand. Amos emphasized in verse 13 that the one whom they are called to meet now is the mighty God. He's the one who forms the mountains, the one who creates the wind. He's the God who declares his intentions to men. He's the God who turns the morning light into darkness, who treads upon the high places of the earth. You could put it all together and just simply say he is the God who is infinitely greater than us. He is the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of armies. And when Israel meet him, the sense is they will not stand. They might have ignored hunger and hardship, thirst, natural disaster, supernatural disaster, death of those around them, all sorts of scary things. They might have ignored all those things and trundled on, but they will not be able to ignore God when they meet him. Likewise, how you and I need to appreciate that truth. As God sends chastisements, whether just the rebuke of his word or even the rebuke through troubles that come our way, as God strives to get the attention of men, he does so today in grace. He does so today calling for people to turn from folly, turn from waywardness, turn from sin, to seek him, to come to the cross and to rest in the Savior who bled and died for sinners, to seek him. The way of reconciliation has been made for us through Christ. You're called to seek him today in grace. But the warning is that if you fail to seek the Lord while he appeals in grace, the day will come when you must meet him and you will not be able to ignore him. Your ruin will come and you cannot stand before him. Today is the day to be saved then. Today is the day to be restored. Today is the day to walk with God. Today is the day to seek Christ and be reconciled. And so what I would say to you just as I close is, before the Lord has to say to you in judgment, prepare to meet thy God, I would say to you by way of invitation, prepare to meet thy God. Make preparation the way that God has provided for you through the Savior. Look afresh to Christ, the Savior of the sinful, the restorer of the wayward. May God apply his word to our hearts. Amen.